Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Pragmatism, the Classic Writings, edited by H.S. Thayer. And this is a collection of writings from some of the early major pragmatist thinkers. Primarily, of course, William James and John Dewey and Charles Peirce, the big three. But also this includes some writings from George Mead, whom I have heard of and encountered elsewhere, and Clarence Irving Lewis, whom I have not heard of or encountered elsewhere. And there's only one essay from Lewis, and there's two writings from George Herbert Mead, and only one from Clarence Irving Lewis, and those guys are tucked into the end of the book. The main writers, of course, are Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. And I'm going to do 2 episodes on this book, this episode and next episode as well. In each episode, I'm just going to cover one essay. The first episode, this one, is going to be an essay by John Dewey, and next episode will also be an essay by John Dewey. I haven't gotten an awful lot into Dewey yet. I did review one of his books, but the main reason this episode that I want to look at a John Dewey essay is because he's got an essay that's in here separate from his main section. He's got another essay tucked into the very beginning, kind of bundled up with the introduction. So it's intended not to be really part of the John Dewey section, but part of the introduction. And that's, I think, the best instance in this book of an overview of what pragmatism is. It's a history. The section is called The Development of American Pragmatism, and it's from John Dewey's book, Philosophy and Civilization, from 1931. There are a few essays in here that seem to be attempts to define what pragmatism is, and frankly, I didn't find any of them all that clear. The best section defining pragmatism is in the William James section, where he, there's a part of it taken from his book Pragmatism. But I've already covered that book, and I believe in particular I covered the sections that are in here. I read some from those sections when I covered that book Pragmatism early on in the podcast a few years back. So this is a pretty good examination, overview of pragmatism. It takes a sort of a historical view. He talks about Charles Peirce said this, and then William James said this, and just sort of a historical overview of the origins of pragmatism. Charles Peirce's section, trying to explain what pragmatism is, I didn't find all that great. William James's section, he does have a part where he's trying to say, what pragmatism is. It's from an interview with the New York Times in 1907, and he tries to write up, William James actually writes up he writes a brief essay for purposes of the interview and gives it to his interviewer. And the objective is to sort of write down what pragmatism is to clarify it for a non-academic audience. It's only like a page, couple pages, 4 pages. And I don't think it succeeds at that. It doesn't really explain an awful lot. I'm going to skip over that. I just want to look at this section from John Dewey, the sort of historical overview. That's about the best you get here of the overview of what pragmatism is. Then there's another section. Next episode, I'm also going to look at another essay by John Dewey, which is less of an overview of pragmatism and more of a contribution to pragmatism. Now, like all my episodes, I'm going to read some sections here and provide a little bit of commentary. John Dewey can be challenging, I've found. He's clearly a smart guy and a pretty good writer, but he has a few, I think, blind spots, and I've talked about that in the past, and I'm sure I'm going to talk about it in this episode and next episode, probably more so next episode, when I really get to John Dewey's contribution to pragmatism as opposed to his overview. He is essentially sort of a center-left kind of fellow, and I think he draws conclusions from the pragmatic premises that shouldn't be drawn, and I think he also carries some of his political ideas in and tries to infuse those political ideas into his examination of pragmatism where they don't really fit. I don't think John Dewey, frankly, is a complete pragmatist. I think he's a partial pragmatist, but partially he is an idealist. He's considered a pragmatist, and he is a pragmatist, but it's only on account of the fact that William James died young, and somewhat young, and he wrote late in his life, so that William James's main period of productivity really only was about 15 years long, and then he passed away. Whereas John Dewey was a very prolific writer, and he lived for a long time. So there's just a lot more from John Dewey. And after William James brought pragmatism into the public conversation, he died shortly after, and John Dewey sort of carried the mantle. But had William James lived longer, William James would be, I think, much more of the pragmatist. He is, although in some ways, I wonder whether William James completely embodies pragmatism. Even though you could say that he invented it, he also inherited it from Charles Peirce. Charles Peirce was not a prolific writer. And I don't know as though any three of these guys completely followed through with their premises. Probably Peirce most of all, but Peirce wrote the least. And then William James took what Peirce wrote and he steered it off in his own direction. And John Dewey took what James wrote and steered it off in his own direction. But none of them really carried on what Peirce had started, I don't think. And maybe Peirce didn't really take it far enough. Peirce didn't apply it to much outside of sort of a formal logic that was his realm, and that was where he applied pragmatism. And then William James tried to apply it to philosophy in general and life in general. And I can't help but feel like pragmatism has, at least, I mean, I haven't read every pragmatist writer. I'm working my way through these early writers right now. I want to understand pragmatism because I don't think pragmatism has ever really been properly followed through to its conclusions and applied to philosophy and politics and psychology and everything else the way that it should be. Maybe some of the later pragmatists in the latter portion of the 20th century may have come closer to that. But of course, philosophy in the latter portion of the 20th century was a very left-leaning endeavor. And I think that pragmatism can perhaps be understood better when it's not so explicitly leftist. And even perhaps pragmatism could lead us toward a more right-leaning position. So part of my project in coming back to these pragmatism books over and over again is that I want to understand pragmatism from a conservative, right-wing vantage point. And I think that's going to be a more accurate, honest pragmatism. And of course, the idea that you should just engage in philosophy without coming at it from any direction at all, any political direction at all, that's just, I mean, I understand the appeal, but that's just not the way life works. Everybody carries with them some biases, and And I think one of the best things we can do is to admit that and accept that. Because an awful lot of people, let's say John Dewey is one of them, continually bring their political opinions into their philosophy, but they never quite accept or admit that that's what they're doing. It's always, well, this is the self-evident way that things are. It's never admitted that this is a political, and maybe it is self-evident to them, and maybe my ideas are self-evident to me, but they're political ideas. Where John Dewey fails is when he presents his political ideas, but doesn't really admit that that's what they are, that they're political ideas. That's a problem in a lot of philosophy. It's a problem in sociology and psychology. It's a problem a lot of the time. The leftist position, the Marxist position, is just sort of assumed as a default and never explicitly acknowledged, despite the fact that it runs through so much philosophy. So with all that said, I'm going to jump in here and look at the section called The Development of American Pragmatism by John Dewey, where he provides this overview. He starts off talking a little bit about Peirce, Charles Peirce. I'm not going to read the entirety of this essay, but I do have some sections. I think I've got 5 or 6 sections. 6 sections. And the sections that I want to read are a little on the long side. Some of them are a little on the long side, so bear with me. But this will be a pretty good dive into early pragmatism and what these guys thought pragmatism was. That's kind of what we're trying to pin down. What did these early pragmatists, the guys who laid the foundation, what did they think they were doing? What did they think pragmatism is? So in talking about Charles Peirce, John Dewey says, quote, "The essay in which Peirce developed his theory bears the title, 'How to Make Our Ideas Clear.' There is a remarkable similarity here to Kant's doctrine. Peirce's effort was to interpret the universality of concepts in the domain of experience in the same way in which Kant established the law of practical reason in the domain of the a priori. The rational meaning of every proposition lies in the future, but of the myriads of forms into which a proposition may be translated, what is that one which is to be called its very meaning? It is, according to the pragmatist, that form in which the proposition becomes applicable to human conduct, not in these or those special circumstances, nor when one entertains this or that special design, but that form which is most directly applicable to self-control under every situation and to every purpose. So, also, the pragmatist does not make the greatest good to consist in action, but makes it to consist in that process of evolution whereby the existent comes more and more to embody generals. In other words, the process whereby the existent becomes, with the aid of action, a body of rational tendencies, or of habits, generalized as much as possible. These statements of Peirce are quite conclusive with respect to 2 errors which are commonly committed in regard to the idea of the founder of pragmatism. It is often said of pragmatism that it makes action the end of life. It is also said of pragmatism that it subordinates thought and rational activity to particular ends of interest and profit. It is true that the theory, according to Peirce's conception, implies essentially a certain relation to action, to human conduct, but the role of action is that of an intermediary. In order to be able to attribute a meaning to concepts, one must be able to apply them to existence. Now it is by means of action that this application is made possible, and the modifications of existence which result from this application constitute the true meaning of concepts. Pragmatism is therefore far from being that glorification of action for its own sake, which is regarded as the peculiar characteristic of American life. It is also to be noted that there is a scale of possible applications of concepts to existence, and hence a diversity of meanings. The greater the extension of the concepts, the more they are freed from the restrictions which limit them to particular cases. the more it is possible for us to attribute the greatest generality of meaning to a term. Thus, the theory of Peirce is opposed to every restriction of the meaning of a concept to the achievement of a particular end, and still more to a personal aim. It is still more strongly opposed to the idea that reason or thought should be reduced to being a servant of any interest which is pecuniary or narrow. This theory was American in its origin, insofar as it insisted on the necessity of human conduct and the fulfillment of some aim in order to clarify thought. But at the same time, it disapproves of those aspects of American life which make action an end in itself, and which conceive ends too narrowly and too practically. In considering a system of philosophy in its relation to national factors, it is necessary to keep in mind not only the aspects of life which are incorporated in the system, but also the aspects against which the system is a protest. There never was a philosopher who has merited the name for the simple reason that he glorified the tendencies and characteristics of his social environment. Just as it is also true that there has never been a philosopher who has not seized upon certain aspects of the life of his time and idealized them. End quote. So, as you can see, it's challenging writing. It's challenging to dig through and understand exactly what he's saying. But he's talking about Charles Peirce's essay, How to Make Our Ideas Clear. And I'm going to skip over where he relates it to Kant, because I'm not familiar enough with Kant to comment on that. But essentially, going back to Peirce's statement, there's a spot here early on where he's quoting Peirce. And so looking at that quote of Peirce, he's saying, of the myriad forms into which a proposition may be translated, what is the one which is to be called its very meaning? It is, according to the pragmatist, that form in which the proposition becomes applicable to human conduct. So, to have a statement about the way things are, some statement about something, or some statement about some circumstances, the meaning of that statement is related to how it affects human conduct. What the impact of that is on how you behave. So, in other words, from a scientific perspective, and Peirce often talks about the laboratory as a sort of source of where his ideas are. If you make a hypothesis that at some certain temperature, some material will have a chemical reaction and change, you can engage in activities to verify that proposition. There's a modification in human conduct, in the things that you do and the way that you act, right, to put on this experiment to yield some sort of result. If the statement about something, if there's no way for you to change your behavior to do this or to do that, to subject this thing to this stimulus or subject that to that stimulus, if there's no way for you to actively test things by doing something and seeing the results, then it becomes a meaningless statement. The statement about the thing, whatever it may be, it only means something in the way that a person can interact with that statement. The classic example that William James uses is the question of whether God exists. And this is something that he brings up in his essay, The Will to Believe, and also in his essay, The Dilemma of Determinism. This is an issue that James comes back to again and again, as I've said previously. James's approach was, what difference does it make whether God exists? If it affects the way that you behave, then it's a meaningful question. But if you would behave exactly the same, whether God exists or whether God doesn't exist, then it becomes a meaningless question. If the world would be different, how would it be different? Like any material change in the world would be something that you could uncover through your action. Now, the easiest way for me to understand pragmatism is not so much in modifications of human conduct. I have to sort of wrap my head around that way of phrasing it. I tend to think of it more in terms of the consequences on people and on our observations, on our stimuli. So a thing has one quality, then this will happen as a result of that. If this thing is, and to use a really physiological example, if something is red, it's going to have an effect on certain color-receiving cells in your eyeballs. It's going to have an effect on you. If it's blue, it's going to affect different cells in different ways. I'm not an expert on the eye, but it's going to have a different effect materially on your eyeball, on the inner surface of your eyeball. There's going to be a material impact in the difference in color between one thing and another. There's a consequence that we can perceive to that question. If the question about something is not perceivable, if it's not something that you can tangibly make a judgment on, something that you can observe or in other ways measure, it's like a metaphysical question that you can't see and you can't measure. And if you can't see it, you can't measure it, you can't observe it, you can't respond to it in some way, then it's a meaningless distinction. This all seems sort of strange and remote and perhaps obvious, but it comes down to philosophy, because some philosophical questions are, in a way, meaningless. Like if you think about Plato's questions about what justice is, trying to pinpoint what justice is that going to change people's behavior? If people already have a sense of what justice is and they respond to it, but they can't write out a complete and absolute definition of justice, what difference does it make whether or not they can, whether they can write that down, whether they can say it in a way that's so ironclad that Socrates can't poke holes in it? What difference does it really make in how they behave? And I guess this is really where the question of human conduct comes in. If you're trying to pin down some metaphysical question like, what is the true nature of justice? What is the true nature of beauty? What is the true nature of intangible things, numbers, math, and things? What are the true nature of these things? If you can't kind of identify how you would behave differently if the answer to that question was one thing versus another thing, then it's meaningless. It's only the ways in which, if justice is this, then I'll do this, I'll behave this way. But if justice is something slightly different, then I'll behave in a different way. That's the only area in which the question becomes meaningful. Although it's meaningless if your conduct, as a result of the answer to the question of what is justice, if your conduct is not affected, if nobody's conduct is affected by that question, by the answer to that question of what these metaphysical concepts are, if it has no real-world application, if there's nothing that changes, if the answer is one thing or the other thing, then it's a meaningless question, and it's a waste of time to try to put your finger on it. And I guess that's kind of how you could boil this down, is the meaning of a concept is how you behave if the concept is true or false. If a situation is beneficial to you, you will gravitate towards it. If a situation is dangerous, you will move away from it. You will try to avoid it. And that is a meaningful distinction in a situation, how you respond to it. But then if you take the reception of stimuli, for example, the color interacting with your eyeball, and you bundle that into human conduct, which is, another question entirely. Are you acting when you observe something? Are you conducting yourself in a certain manner? And that's a whole other question, the boundaries between receiving information and acting. In that sense, if you were to say that receiving information is a form of conduct, then in that way, that's essentially the extent of it. At any rate, it's definitely hard to understand, and John Dewey doesn't do us any favors by trying to simplify it for us. At any rate, I'm going to move on to where he begins to talk about William James, because I think William James does a lot to bring some of this stuff into a more tangible, meaningful area where we can understand it perhaps a little bit better. So in this regard, he says, quote, "The work commenced by Peirce was continued by William James. In one sense, James narrowed the application of Peirce's pragmatic method, but at the same time he extended it. The articles which Peirce wrote in 1878 commanded almost no attention from philosophical circles, which were then under the dominating influence of the neo-Kantian idealism of Green, of Caird, and of the Oxford School, excepting those circles in which the Scottish philosophy of common sense maintained its supremacy. In 1898, James inaugurated the new pragmatic movement in an address entitled Philosophical Conceptions and Practical Results, later reprinted in the volume Collected Essays and Reviews. Even in this early study, one can easily notice the presence of those two tendencies to restrict and at the same time to extend early pragmatism. After having quoted the psychological remark of Peirce that beliefs are really rules for action, and the whole function of thinking is but one step in the production of habits of action, and that every idea which we frame for ourselves of an object is really an idea of the possible effects of that object, he expressed the opinion that all these principles could be expressed more broadly than Peirce expressed them. The ultimate test for us of what a truth means is indeed the conduct it dictates or inspires. But it inspires that conduct because it first foretells some particular turn to our experience, which shall call for just that conduct from us. And I should prefer to express Peirce's principle by saying that the effective meaning of any philosophic proposition can always be brought down to some particular consequence in our future practical experience, whether active or passive. The point lying rather in the fact that the experience must be particular than in the fact that it must be active. In an essay written in 1908, James repeats this statement and states that whenever he employs the term the practical, he means by it the distinctively concrete, the individual, the particular, and effective, as opposed to the abstract, general, and inert. Pragmata are things in their plurality. Particular consequences can perfectly well be of a theoretic nature. End quote. So now we get William James into the mix. And William James, I think, like I said, sort of makes this start to make sense for us a little more. And one thing that I note here as I was reading this, he does say, he says, I should prefer, he's quoting William James here, saying, I should prefer to express Peirce's principle by saying that the effective meaning of any philosophic proposition. So now we're not talking necessarily about the meaning of everything, the definition of everything, the entirety of knowledge possible about a thing, but he's talking specifically about the meaning of a philosophic proposition. And the meaning of that philosophic proposition can be brought down to some particular consequence in our future practical experience, whether active or passive. So, in other words, there's a consequence of a philosophical idea, but it's not necessarily just a consequence in action. It's also a potential passive experience. You experience things differently when you have a different philosophical disposition. But here's the other thing of, like, as I said, it's hard to draw the line. If you experience things differently, what does that mean as a result of a particular philosophic conception? Well, if you experience something and it makes you feel satisfied, are you experiencing the satisfaction, or are you being satisfied in a way that you're conducting yourself? There's some thought going on in your mind that may be a thought of satisfaction. Let's say anger. Let's say something makes you angry as a result of your grasping hold of a philosophic conception. Are you passively being angered by it in a way that you would experience that scenario in a way that didn't make you angry, but with your new philosophic conception that you've adopted, now you experience it and it makes you angry? Is that something passive that has happened to you, or are there thoughts actively occurring in your mind which are thoughts of anger? Are you conducting yourself differently by responding in a new emotional frame of mind? If you say that the division between experiencing things passively and actively is a sort of a blurry line, then you could embody all of that into experience rather than acting or receiving passively and being acted upon. If you just say you're experiencing things differently, but is that sort of just a way of whitewashing it? I don't know, and I'm not certain I'm ready to completely pin this down again. I'm still learning about all this, but a part that I like that he's essentially quoting William James quoting Peirce, the psychological remark of Peirce that beliefs are really rules for action. We've touched on this a little bit. A belief is like the whole purpose of knowing things, the purpose of learning things, the purpose of thinking. Like, if we can walk this back a little bit to some of the other things that we've seen in other pragmatic essays that I've looked at, the purpose of thinking is to achieve a state of mental satisfaction, to stop thinking. Just like the purpose of fighting is to end the fight, right? You fight because you want to win, and then when you're done, you stop fighting because you've won the fight. You're fighting in order to get out to the other side. You're thinking in order to solve a problem. Some problem has presented itself to you, and you think your way through it in order to resolve the problem so that you don't have to puzzle over it anymore. You're puzzling over something in order to get through the difficulty and get to the other side where you don't have to puzzle any longer. So that's the sort of sense of rationality or the position of belief, of believing in something. But even then, why do you want to believe in things? Why do you want to have knowledge about the world? Why do you want to know that something is this way instead of that way? Because it will impact your actions, and it may impact potential actions. You may take some piece of information and tuck it away in your mind and maybe act on it, and maybe you don't act on it because you're going to evaluate whether it's worth whatever the effort may be to follow through with this particular idea that you have and see it to its fruition in a manifested way, materially. But ultimately, you believe things because they guide your actions. Jumping back here specifically, he says, beliefs are really rules for action, and the whole function of thinking is but one step in the production of habits of action. Every idea we frame for ourselves of an object is really an idea of the possible effects of that object. He says, the ultimate test for us of what a truth means is indeed the conduct it dictates or inspires. But it inspires that conduct because it first foretells some particular turn to our experience which shall call for just that conduct from us. What does that mean? Well, the first sentence, the ultimate test for us of what a truth means is indeed the conduct it dictates or inspires. So first of all, we have to come back to the idea that I pointed out in the very first episode of my Pragmatism examination, which was when I read William James's book called Pragmatism. And I talked about there, although James doesn't talk about it at great length, but I said I think it's an important point to make when we're thinking about pragmatism, is that all of our knowledge is some form of approximation of reality. Right? Our knowledge is not an exact knowledge of reality. It's a sketch of reality. It's a sketch of reality that serves our purposes. We know enough about a thing to make our way, right? I know enough about how a car works to be able to get in it and drive around. I don't have to necessarily know everything about it. The more you know about it, the more you're able to do with it, and those are rules for action, but you never know every nick, every scratch, every smudge of grease, every atom, if you want to get down to it. You never know every single thing about anything. You just know enough about it to be able to do what you need to do. Whether what you need to do is something small or something large, you're going to know enough about it to create an approximate sketch of the thing. You're going to know enough about another person to be able to interact with them in the ways in which you normally would interact with them successfully. You don't need to know everything about another person. If you're ordering a coffee at a coffee shop, you don't need to know everything about the cashier, but you need to know what language they speak. You need to know which way they're facing, whether they're listening to you or not. You need to know enough to get by. And it's always a sort of approximation of a reality that is more complex than you know. You never know the entirety of the other person. You know enough about them, and you create a mental sketch of who they are, what they want, what they're doing. You jump to some conclusions. You assume they're listening to you when you're talking. It's all just approximations. Your knowledge is approximations. Now, you have some objective in your life. So he says, jumping back to this section, he's talking about how these ideas can be expressed more broadly than Peirce expressed them. So he's taking Peirce's kind of discussions about logic and knowledge, and he's applying it a little bit more broadly outside of like the laboratory, empirical, experimental mindset that Peirce has, and is applying it more to general day-to-day life. At any rate, when Dewey quotes William James, he says, the ultimate test for us of what a truth means is indeed the conduct it dictates or inspires. So let's stop there. The test for what a truth means is the conduct it dictates or inspires. So your knowledge of another person is going to modify how you interact with them, what you do. You're not going to stand in a state of befuddlement at the coffee counter. You're going to order your coffee, or you're going to do this or that. You may stand in a state of befuddlement if circumstances warrant it, but what you know about the situation, what you know about the person you're interacting with, where you are, what you're doing there, the things that you know about your circumstances have meaning. He says the test of what the truth means is the conduct it dictates or inspires. So all of these things that you know, they have value to you because they impact your behavior. And I think it's important to point out that in some sense they could impact your behavior. If there's a step to your left, and if you walk that way, you'll trip and fall if you don't know that the step is there. Now, you may have no intention of moving off to the left. You may want to move off to the right. But you know the step is there. You see the step, observe it, register it in your mind. There's a piece of knowledge in your mind that says the step is there. And should you find yourself in a situation in which you want to step to the left, you can draw on that piece of knowledge that you have. So it's affecting your potential actions, not just your actions. But it has meaning and it has value. It's lodged in your mind, and you draw up an approximation of what exactly is going on over there on the left in order to have it for potentially acting on it. Either definitely acting on it or potentially acting on it. That's, I think, important to keep in mind here. Like, if you think that the things that you know are only those things that specifically affect your conduct, then your conduct is somewhat limited. Everything I see in my field of vision lodges itself as a sort of piece of knowledge. Now, perhaps it's just a fuzzy piece of knowledge that something is over there of a certain color, but I don't pay it much mind because perhaps I'm walking down the street and I don't need to know everything about everything. And so, like, you might say, well, how does that piece of knowledge that there's a person across the street walking their dog affect my conduct when I'm just walking from here to there, from point A to point B? All of the other things I can see, all of the other pieces of knowledge that are lodged in my brain in some degree of vagueness, they're there for your potential conduct. They're there that should you want to cross the street, you should know that there's a person walking their dog over there. But here, where he says, the next sentence after that, but it inspires that conduct because it first foretells some particular turn to our experience, which shall call for just that conduct from us. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think that's saying that you can expect something to happen if you do a certain thing. The person across the street with the dog, there's certain things that may happen if I cross the street. It foretells some particular turn to our experience, right? It foretells when we know a thing, we can make predictions on what we know about how our experience will be modified if we should do this or should do that. And those expectations may be very minor. I think a lot of the bits of knowledge that we have in our day-to-day life, they don't all always inspire conduct. They don't all always prompt us to do this or do that. Every little bit of knowledge isn't inspiring an action, but it's proposing to you a potential consequence. It's telling you that if I go over there and stand in that spot, I'm going to bump into this person. It's laying out a potential course. And although the effect on your conduct may be very slight, right? I wasn't planning on going over there and standing in that spot because I'm, as I said, going from point A to point B. But I know somewhere in my mind that my conduct, my range of potential conduct is now slightly restricted. If I go stand there, I'll bump into this person, right? Now I have a new potential scenario that I may encounter if I do a certain thing. And so it's only changed my conduct in the sense that it's cut off certain avenues because it foretells an experience. This piece of knowledge I have lays out a potential scenario, and my contemplation, conscious or otherwise, of this potential scenario does have some impact on my conduct or on my potential conduct. My inclination to continue on my path and not go stand there for perhaps no reason or for perhaps some reason, perhaps to look at a puddle, who knows. But my potential range of conduct is constrained. That's about what I think where he's going with that. But sometimes it doesn't seem like. It seems like they take some of the ideas that every bit of knowledge affects your experience and affects your conduct. Sometimes it seems as though they take it too far. How does every piece of knowledge really affect my conduct? Anyway, let's keep moving. Continuing to talk about William James. He says, quote, William James accomplished a new advance in pragmatism by his theory of the will to believe, or as he himself later called it, the right to believe. The discovery of the fundamental consequences of one or another belief has without fail a certain influence on that belief itself. If a man cherishes novelty, risk, opportunity, and a variegated aesthetic reality, he will certainly reject any belief in monism when he clearly perceives the import of this system. But if, from the very start, he's attracted by aesthetic harmony, classic proportions, fixity, even to the extent of absolute security and logical coherence, it is quite natural that he should put faith in monism. Thus William James took into account those motives of instinctive sympathy, which play a greater role in our choice of a philosophic system than do formal reasonings. And he thought that we should be rendering a service to the cause of philosophical sincerity if we would openly recognize the motives which inspire us. He also maintained the thesis that the greater part of philosophic problems, and especially those which touch on religious fields, are of such a nature that they are not susceptible of decisive evidence one way or the other. Consequently, he claimed the right of a man to choose his beliefs, not only in the presence of proofs or conclusive facts, but also in the absence of all such proof. Above all, when he is forced to choose between one meaning or another, or when by refusing to choose he has a right to assume the risks of faith, his refusal is itself equivalent to a choice. The theory of the will to believe gives rise to misunderstandings and even to ridicule, and therefore it is necessary to understand clearly in what way James used it. We are always obliged to act in any case. Our actions, and with them their consequences, actually change according to the beliefs which we have chosen. Moreover, it may be that, in order to discover the proofs which will ultimately be the intellectual justification of certain beliefs, the belief in freedom, for example, or the belief in God, it is necessary to begin to act in accordance with this belief. In his lectures on pragmatism, and in his volume of essays bearing the title The Meaning of Truth, which appeared in 1909, James extended the use of the pragmatic method to the problem of the nature of truth. So far we have considered the pragmatic method as an instrument in determining the meaning of words and the vital importance of philosophic beliefs. Now and then we have made allusion to the future consequences which are implied. James showed, among other things, that in certain philosophic conceptions, the affirmation of certain beliefs could be justified by means of the nature of their consequences, or by the differences which these beliefs make in existence. But then why not push the argument to the point of maintaining that the meaning of truth in general is determined by its consequences? We must not forget here that James was an empiricist before he was a pragmatist, and repeatedly stated that pragmatism is merely empiricism pushed to its legitimate conclusions. From a general point of view, the pragmatic attitude consists in looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, facts. It is only one step further to apply the pragmatic method to the problem of truth. In the natural sciences, there is a tendency to identify truth in any particular case with a verification. The verification of a theory, or of a concept, is carried on by the observance of particular facts. Even the most scientific and harmonious physical theory is merely an hypothesis until its implications, deduced by mathematical reasoning or by any other kind of inference, are verified by observed facts. What direction, therefore, must an empirical philosopher take who wishes to arrive at a definition of truth by means of an empirical method? He must, if he wants to apply this method and without bringing in for the present the pragmatic formula, first find particular cases from which he then generalizes. It is therefore in submitting conceptions to the control of experience, in the process of verifying them, that one finds examples of what is called truth. Therefore, any philosopher who applies this empirical method, without the least prejudice in favor of pragmatic doctrine, can be led to conclude that truth means verification, or if one prefers, that verification, either actual or possible, is the definition of truth. In combining this conception of empirical method with the theory of pragmatism, we come upon other important philosophical results. The classic theories of truth, in terms of the coherence or compatibility of terms, and of the correspondence of an idea with a thing, hereby receive a new interpretation. A merely mental coherence, without experimental verification, does not enable us to get beyond the realm of hypothesis. If a notion or a theory makes pretense of corresponding to reality or to the facts, this pretense cannot be put to the test and confirmed or refuted except by causing it to pass over into the realm of action, and by noting the results which it yields, in the form of the concrete observable facts to which this notion or theory leads. If, in acting upon this notion, we are brought to the fact which it implies or which it demands, then this notion is true. A theory corresponds to the facts when it leads to the facts which are its consequences, by the intermediary of experience. And from this consideration the pragmatic generalization is drawn, that all knowledge is prospective in its results, except in the case where notions and theories, after having been first prospective in their application, have already been tried out and verified. Theoretically, however, even such verifications or truths could not be absolute. They would be based upon practical or moral certainty, but they are always subject to being corrected by unforeseen future consequences or by observed facts which had been disregarded. Every proposition concerning truth is really, in the last analysis, hypothetical and provisional, although a large number of these propositions have been so frequently verified without failure that we are justified in using them as if they were absolutely true. But, logically, absolute truth is an ideal which cannot be realized, at least not until all the facts have been registered, or, as James says, bagged, and until it is no longer possible to make other observations and other experiences. End quote. All right, so there's a lot in that part there. Let's look through and see what we can gather from there. I want to start at the very end when he's talking about the provisional quality of truth. He says, all knowledge is prospective in its results, except in the case where notions and theories, after having been first prospective in their application, have already been tried out and verified. So everything that you know, if you haven't, or you think you know, if you haven't tested it and observed in reality the verification of that knowledge, then it's prospective knowledge. It's potential knowledge. And then if it's been tried out and verified, then, well, it's still sort of prospective knowledge because there is no real absolute truth. There's always the possibility that somehow you're mistaken, somehow you've misinterpreted something, somehow you've ignored something. Some other theory will come along which explains the things that you know, as well as additional things that are, perhaps to be observed under different circumstances, or plugs any gaps in what you think you know. In other words, the approximation of reality becomes more clear through some additional knowledge or some additional theory. But when things are seem to be, at any rate, verified by experience again and again and again, we can pretty much presume that they're true, and we can act as if they're true. But technically, we can't ever achieve absolute knowledge and absolute truth. But let's walk back a little bit. The beginning of that section, he talks a little bit about monism, and he talks about the personalities of philosophers, and essentially that if a person has a disposition toward aesthetically, he's attracted to certain types of features of thoughts, like risk, opportunity, novelty, and variety, then he's not going to believe in monism. He's not going to focus on the unity of all things. He's not going to believe in philosophical theories or promote philosophical theories that promote monism, that focus on the completeness of the system. Whereas if someone's attracted to that sort of aesthetic quality, if they're attracted to thoughts that have that particular organization, structure, harmony, if they're attracted to that sort of thing, then their philosophical theories will lean more in that direction. And William James, he says, he thought that we should be rendering a service to the cause of philosophical sincerity if we would openly recognize the motives which inspire us. As I said, like in the beginning of this episode, there are so many people who are philosophers or thinkers in some form who have dispositions towards certain things that they think are values. They have sets of values, what is important to them and what is less important to them or not important to them, or perhaps even repulsive to them. And they're going to build their philosophy in such a way that it confirms the things that they like and rejects the things that they don't like. And then they will present it as if it is unbiased, as if it is, the absolute truth or the result of very careful examination. But everybody's disposition it comes through their philosophy, and we do better when we simply acknowledge that we have biases and dispositions toward one value or set of values or another set of values, and the philosophies we craft or the philosophies we adhere to reflect that. Anyway, let's keep moving to the next section where he says, quote, one might complete this brief enumeration by mentioning also the chapter of James's book in which he discusses the nature of necessary truths and the role of experience, and affirms, in opposition to Herbert Spencer, that many of our most important modes of perception and conception of the world of sensible objects are not the cumulative products of particular experience, but rather original biological sports, spontaneous variations, which are maintained because of their applicability to concrete experiences after having once been created. Number, space, time, resemblance, and other important categories could have been brought into existence, he says, as a consequence of some particular cerebral instability, but they could by no means have been registered on the mind by outside influence. Many significant and useless concepts also arise in the same manner, but the fundamental categories have been cumulatively extended and reinforced because of their value when applied to concrete instances and things of experience. It is therefore not the origin of a concept, it is its application, which becomes the criterion of its value. And here we have the whole of pragmatism in embryo. A phrase of James's very well summarizes its import. The popular notion that science is forced on the mind from without, and that our interests have nothing to do with its constructions, is utterly absurd. Given the point of view which we have just specified, and the interest attaching to a logical theory of conception and judgment, and their results of a theory of the following description. The adaptations made by inferior organisms, for example, their effective and coordinated responses to stimuli, become teleological in man, and therefore give occasion to thought. Reflection is an indirect response to the environment, and the element of indirection can itself become great and very complicated, but it has its origin in biological adaptive behavior, and the ultimate function of its cognitive aspect is a prospective control of the conditions of the environment. The function of intelligence is therefore not that of copying the objects of the environment, but rather of taking account of the way in which more effective and more profitable relations with these objects may be established in the future. End quote. So what is he saying here? Well, he is talking about Herbert Spencer, William James responding to Herbert Spencer. We had mentioned that previously. Herbert Spencer apparently saying that the world of sensible objects, modes of perception, the contents of the mind are the cumulative products of particular experiences. And James is saying that at their origin point, they're really just mental fluctuations, almost mental accidents that fit the world. And he's kind of talking about memetics. He's talking about ideas that spontaneously arrive in the mind and work. They're effective in guiding a person's interaction with the environment. When one believes in three-dimensional space and time and things like that, those are just spontaneous thoughts in, remarkably primitive entities, creatures, that help it make its way in the world. At base, they're just variations, random variations. He specifically says biological sports, spontaneous variations, which are maintained because of their applicability to concrete experiences after having once been created. And because they work, they are passed on and they spread like memes. So that's interesting. That's kind of like a prelude to Dawkins a little bit. But it's all, he says, reflection is an indirect response to the environment. So you see things and it causes you to reflect on them. He says, it has its origin in biological adaptive behavior, and the ultimate function of its cognitive aspect is a prospective control of the conditions of the environment. The function of intelligence is therefore not that of copying the objects of the environment. In other words, the purpose of the mind, and this is important, the purpose of the mind is not to just know things, to create some sort of mental copy of the world, so that the world is comprised of neutrons and protons and electrons, and now I have neutrons, protons, and electrons in my mind because I understand them. Now I have concepts of these things. I have a picture in my mind of the shape of the atom, which is a correspondence to the atom itself. But that's not the purpose of the mind. That's not the purpose of our cognitive function. We are evolved creatures, and just knowing things doesn't provide any real benefit. It's a drain on mental resources to know things. It requires the brain matter, and it requires calories to process things, know things, learn things, remember things. These are all drains on our resources. And if knowing things didn't help us survive, then we wouldn't know them. We wouldn't have that capacity. So really the purpose of knowing things is modifying our behavior in order to survive better. Knowledge, the capacity for knowledge, cognition, reflection, these are adaptive traits of the human being that help us survive. And surviving is the product of acting. We know things so that we can act on them, or so that we can, like I said, potentially act on them, so that the possibility exists of us acting on them. And as I said, the possibility alone modifies our conduct in some minor way. Sometimes Dewey's writing is easier, and sometimes it's harder to comprehend. But at base, it's revolving around this core point that the purpose of knowledge is to survive, and the mechanism of survival is acting on the world, acting in the world in a way that yields consequences for us, yields benefits for us. So let's move on from there. The last section I'm going to read here, he says, quote, "It should be clear, after this rapid survey of the history of pragmatism, that American thought continues European thought. We have imported our language, our laws, our institutions, our morals, and our religion from Europe, and we have adapted them to the new conditions of our life. The same is true of our ideas. For long years, our philosophical thought was merely an echo of European thought. Since these systems are readaptations, they take into consideration the distinctive traits of the environment of American life. But, as has already been said, they are not limited to reproducing what is worn and imperfect in this environment. They do not aim to glorify the energy and the love of action which the new conditions of American life exaggerated. They do not reflect the excessive mercantilism of American life. Without doubt, all these traits of the environment have not been without a certain influence on American philosophical thought. Our philosophy would not be national or spontaneous if it were not subject to this influence. But the fundamental idea which the movements of which we have just spoken have attempted to express is the idea that action and opportunity justify themselves only to the degree in which they render life more reasonable and increase its value. Instrumentalism maintains, in opposition to many contrary tendencies in the American environment, that action should be intelligent and reflective, and that thought should occupy a central position in life. That is the reason for our insistence on the teleological phrase of thought and knowledge. If it must be teleological in particular, and not merely true in the abstract, that is probably due to the practical element, which is found in all the phases of American life. However that may be, what we insist upon above all else is that intelligence be regarded as the only source and sole guarantee of a desirable and happy future. It is beyond doubt that the progressive and unstable character of American life and civilization has facilitated the birth of a philosophy which regards the world as being in continuous formation, where there is still place for indeterminism, for the new, and for a real future. But this idea is not exclusively American, although the conditions of American life have aided this idea in becoming self-conscious. It is also true that Americans tend to underestimate the value of tradition of rationality, considered as an achievement of the past. But the world also has given proof of irrationality in the past, and this irrationality is incorporated in our beliefs and our institutions. There are bad traditions as there are good ones. It is always important to distinguish. Our neglect of the traditions of the past, with whatever this negligence implies in the way of spiritual impoverishment of our life, has its compensation in the idea that the world is recommencing and being remade under our eyes. The future, as well as the past, can be a source of interest and consolation and give meaning to the present. Pragmatism and instrumental experimentalism bring into prominence the importance of the individual. It is he who is the carrier of creative thought, the author of action and of its application. Subjectivism is an old story in philosophy, a story which began in Europe and not in America. But American philosophy, in the systems which we have expounded, has given to the subject, to the individual mind, a practical rather than an epistemological function. The individual mind is important because only the individual mind is the organ of modification in traditions and institutions, the vehicle of experimental creation. One-sided and egoistic individualism in American life has left its imprint on our practices. For better or for worse, depending on the point of view, it has transformed the aesthetic and fixed individualism of the old European culture into an active individualism. But the idea of a society of individuals is not foreign to American thought. It penetrates even our current individualism, which is unreflective and brutal. And the individual which American thought idealizes is not an individual per se. an individual fixed in isolation and set up for himself, but an individual who evolves and develops in a natural and human environment, an individual who can be educated, end quote. Okay, so what in the world is going on with this section? He's talking about America and the American tendencies and how they've impacted philosophy, and he talks about how we've inherited so much from Europe, but we also have particular circumstances that we live in America that have influenced our philosophy. And he makes some strange statements in this section, and I think this is where John Dewey starts to get onto shakier ground. The first thing that jumps out at me is where he says, the fundamental idea which the movements of which we have just spoken have attempted to express is the idea that action and opportunity justify themselves only to the degree in which they render life more reasonable and increase its value. So there's a back and forth here. So action and opportunity, right? Well, let's just stick with action for the moment. Justifies itself to the degree to which it renders life reasonable and increases its value. So there's an end here to the action. The action itself is justified insofar as it increases life's value and makes life more reasonable. So, right, he said previously in the beginning of this episode, John Dewey was saying it's not that pragmatism advocates for action for its own sake, doing things just to do them rather than contemplating. Contemplation is meaningless, to act is meaningful, so go forth and act, with no particular point or objective. That's not really what pragmatism is saying or is about, and that's kind of a deep misinterpretation of it. But what is the end? Well, the end he puts forward, making life more reasonable and increasing its value. And then he says instrumentalism maintains, in opposition to many contrary tendencies in the American environment, that action should be intelligent and reflective, and that thought should occupy a central position in life. He says that is the reason for our insistence on the teleological phrase of thought and knowledge. If it must be teleological in particular, and not merely true in the abstract, in other words, teleological in the sense of aiming towards something, and not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge in the abstract, but teleological, knowing things in order to move forward to a consequence, to a result. He says if it must be teleological in particular, and not merely true in the abstract, that is probably due to the rational element which is found in all the phases of American life. However they may be, what we insist upon above all else is that intelligence be regarded as the only source and sole guarantee of a desirable and happy future. Now this is where, how did you get that from pragmatism? How did you come to the conclusion that intelligence alone is the only source and sole guarantee of a desirable and happy future? This is the classic scenario of the thinker who thinks that thinking is the greatest thing ever. That intelligent analysis is the only guarantee of good, happy life. Don't take me for someone who completely discounts thinking as a useless activity, but the capacity to pin down what the desired consequences are versus the undesired consequences. I mean, everything is evaluated, every philosophy, every action, every piece of knowledge, every object in the world, everything is evaluated according to its consequences, according to its impact on us, according to the ways in which it modifies our behavior, according to the ways in which it inspires us to do this versus to do that, to have this disposition or that, to be angry, to be happy, the various ways in which it modifies our behavior or otherwise has a consequence on us or on our environment, that's how we can know things, and that's how we can understand them, and that's how we can evaluate them, and that's how we can determine whether or not we value them. But what are the consequences that we're aiming for, and what are the consequences that we're avoiding? And the most common regular criticism of pragmatism is that it doesn't really say anything about what we want from our consequences. And that's why it's so often and so easily said, well, pragmatism is just justification of profit and benefit and personal gain. And because it's very easy to just sort of plug in, well, whatever's good for me is true. And that's this like mischaracterization, but it's a common and easy to apply mischaracterization, because pragmatism isn't saying much about what the good result is and the bad result. And John Dewey has a tendency to say, well, the good result is the result that increases the amount of science, that increases the amount of rationality, that increases the amount of happiness, is sort of utilitarian, the most happiness for the most people. What's good, the good results are human progress. And that's not ever really justified, right? He says, to look at this sentence again, the fundamental idea which the movements of which we have just spoken have attempted to express is the idea that action and opportunity justify themselves only to the degree in which they render life more reasonable and increase its value. And that is a statement that he just pulls out of a hat. And that, I think, is where pragmatism needs to come back to reality a little bit. And I think we have to take into consideration the idea put forward by Richard Dawkins that we are survival machines. We are designed by our genetics, which are the true replicating components, and who we are, how we think, what we do is all determined for us by our genetic code, in combination, of course, with the things that we've learned about the world. But when we learn things about the world, what are we learning? How to survive. And more than that, how to thrive. How to achieve eudaimonia. I think that the ancients had it right when they're saying that we're all after eudaimonia. Everybody's ultimately seeking eudaimonia. And what is eudaimonia but a life that facilitates successful reproduction, a life of resources, a life of good reputation, the sorts of things that prompt you to procreate successfully, have large numbers of children who are carrying your genetic code, and are able to themselves position themselves to continue for generations and generations. Being a good link in a genetic chain from ancestor to descendant, and not suffering excessively. These are the elements of eudaimonia which dovetail perfectly into successful genetic replication. And if our objective as beings is to advance our genetic code, then that is the goal, right? Eudaimonia and genetic prosperity, procreation for us and for our kin. Because our kin share duplicates, they share copies of our genetic code. Our children share copies of our genetic code. We favor our children because they share copies of our genetic code, and that's what we're trying to, right? Your actual genes don't survive when you die. They decay. It's the code, it's the pattern of your genetics that is replicating itself. The code is replicating itself. Our purpose is to replicate the code. And so a pragmatism with an actual end, an actual purpose, is a pragmatism built around genetic replication. And that's a different sort of pragmatism than just a pragmatism that just has this gauzy advancing democracy or advancing, it's in a sense, yes, advancing human flourishing, but without putting that into a little bit more concrete terms, it gets bandied about and can be used for whatever purpose. And then John Dewey turns it into, well, we just need to, advance science. We need to make everything subject to the purview of intelligence. And that's not exactly eudaimonia. That's something else entirely. That's the sort of world in which John Dewey thrives. And I think that is the same problem that we find again and again with philosophers who aren't able to clearly and easily pin down why we're doing anything at all, why we're doing what we're doing. They just put forward theories, and that's fine, but we know enough now to say that the ancients were correct. We're after eudaimonia, and more specifically, we're after genetic eudaimonia. The happiness of us, the happiness of our families, the flourishing of our families, the flourishing of our tribes, the flourishing of our nations, the flourishing of our in-group who share our genetic codes. That's what we're after. And pragmatism built around genetic eudaimonia is a pragmatism that can be interpreted from a right-wing perspective, as opposed to a pragmatism with a sort of question mark for an end that can very easily be deployed for any purposes at all. So that was my last section. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.